Okay, sorry about that. So, let's talk more about 2008. So in 2008, we also had a thing happen in the mortgage loan business, but that didn't actually trigger like the huge downturn that we had. But anyway, mortgages were also very overvalued because there had been overextension of debt allowed. So initially, when our country was first founded, we had an army. That army was largely unsuccessful, except in the Carolinas. And the army was paid by debt. So that debt ended up being... So what happened was the states waited to pay the federal government the taxes needed to pay the soldiers, and then in that time speculators bought all of the debt off the soldiers for like pennies on the dollar. And then since the speculators were some of the wealthiest people, they had a lot of leverage on the federal government, and they forced the federal government to get the taxes from the states, or they were just waiting and the states just got the money, or the states, or it's either a conspiracy or they used leverage to force the federal government to get the taxes from the states or else face economic repercussions. So that debt, you see a big influx of debt where the government's paying soldiers money it doesn't have. That's debt. And then that debt is devalued. It causes a depression. That's a liquidity crunch. And then taxes have to go up, and it causes, bad things to happen in the economy. So from the beginning of our country, this has been happening. It's happened all over the world. You can trace the movements of gold all over the world and see examples of this. So George Washington was an officer in the British military, and he has some very suspicious things about him. One of which is that he instituted a central bank with the same amount of initial debt, as in he created a bank which initially was going to cause a reduction in federal revenue without even having done anything beneficial for anyone. So he creates this central bank with the same amount of debt that the Bank of England had when it started, which is in disclosure that he's prioritizing central banking interests. And actually at the end of his term, there was a huge protest of 10,000 people in Philadelphia that was only ended because there was an outbreak of yellow fever. Anyway. So he creates this central bank, and then we kind of see movements of gold to the East Coast, and then the profits of the central bank actually end up going overseas. And this becomes like a big issue in our country because no one has any money. All the money that's coming in from exports is being taxed and then sent back overseas, or it's being used to buy like Spain or Louisiana, even though we could have just conquered those countries. The European powers had almost no control over them, but we paid for them anyway. And yeah, I have a whole list of these reductions in liquidity and, examples of times when banks kind of screwed people over. But I'm just going to give the one most horrible one, which was in 1836 or 1837, the Bank of England, in response to Andrew Jackson vetoing the charter for the Third Bank of the United States. He vetoes it, and then 2 or 3 years later, he either vetoed it in 32 or 34. It may have been 32. Anyway, within 4 years of him vetoing it, the Bank of England just decides to throw away all of the paper that all of the debt instruments or financial instruments or debt agreements that they have with the United States. They just kind of give them away for almost no money. And that makes it impossible for anyone to borrow money to trade with the United States. So that causes a huge depression in the United States. And it's all because they couldn't get their monopoly on our credit system, which they would get back in 1913 with the Federal Reserve Act. So interesting thing about that, right before they signed, so they had started to sign that bill under the Aldrich Plan in 1907. And in 1913, there was on the cover of the New York Times, they disclosed that a huge volume of gold was discovered in the, what's that huge river, the Grand Canyon? They discovered like enough gold so there would never be a liquidity crunch again. But then it all disappeared somehow, and it never made its way into anything that would alleviate these liquidity crunches. So there's other examples. In 1857, a gold transport was destroyed, or it capsized in a storm, and that caused a depression along with the ending of a war. Somehow those two things, yeah, confusing, but it happened. So yeah, you can read more about this, but basically the point here is that because of the way our financial system is structured with fractional reserve lending and the fact that militaries have had huge amounts of gold deposits, so they can move gold between countries, they can put a bunch of gold on deposit in every bank, and then once banks overextend the amount of credit because of fractional reserve lending, they can withdraw their gold and cause those banks to be foreclosed on or go into, they can cause those banks to go bankrupt. And it happened, so 1994, Bill Clinton gets elected, and he makes this big deal about how he did a great job with the economy. But really what they did, before, in 1999, they repeal Glass-Steagall. And before they do that, they run up the stock market to the highest price-to-book values we have ever seen. So right before everybody takes their retirement savings and puts in the stock market, which is now legal after 1999 when they repeal Glass-Steagall, they basically make it extremely overpriced. So right when it seems like the stock market's doing so well, what's really happened is prices have been artificially inflated so that when they repealed Glass-Steagall and everyone tried to get in on the great stock market, things were not going to yield good. Basically, retirement, it's like a way of swindling people out of their retirement money, because you couldn't invest your retirement in the stock market prior to 1999, but then they repeal Glass-Steagall when things are way too expensive, and that causes, and then from that point, the stock market, they bring it down slowly. And that's why the 2000s was a crazy time economically, is because we repealed Glass-Steagall. We had all this crazy mortgage stuff going on because Reagan allowed for variable rate mortgages to be issued. And yeah, we have all these crazy derivatives going on. So derivatives were first introduced in grain futures in the mid-1800s, I believe, in Chicago. So Chicago was like this hub of the agriculture business, where farmers would, I believe, ship their stuff by rail to Chicago. And then it basically, a derivative just transferred risk from the banks to the farmers, where instead of just buying food when the farmers delivered it, they would instead agree to deliver it ahead of time. And that meant they would have to borrow money that meant there were some incentives, I think, to borrow money to expand their farms. But also the federal government was always encouraging farmers to borrow money to expand their farms so they could bolster the nation's food supplies. But really it was so they would have more risk on their portfolios. Like, a lot of the things the financial industry does is like increase the amount of risk in people's wealth. Like the derivatives just make it more risky for you to hold your savings in a bank. And deliverable notes, they make it more risky for you to trade in grain or whatever you're trading in. And all of these things make banks more profitable, because if they have less risk, they can trade more assets and make more money. And that is kind of ridiculous because they're the wealthiest people. But again, it just goes back to this idea that the people who have a lot of power have incentives to corrupt the system. They have incentives to tax and control trade. And yeah, they do that. So there is a great deal of financial risk, and it really goes back in history. So our country was established, or our Declaration of Independence was 2 months after the Illuminati was formed in Bavaria, May 1st, 1776. And you can go back, further than that, where, you can look at the influence of these military and mercenary groups and how they control governments, how they're linked to occult practices, and there is kind of like a darker story here that I might save for a different night, just because this video is already going to get a little bit long. But there's a lot of examples of issues in our financial system, and I've kind of written this out a little bit better than I can explain it here in a video. So read that thing. It's called On Money. It's part of 3 treatises on trade. But again, like, the people who are in control of this, they want a new world order, and they think that people are inherently unable to govern themselves. And they also are not really human. They believe that they have a divine right given to them by God to rule over humanity, and that there are some people who are just useless eaters. So they kind of deny the idea that we're all equal, which obviously I've said, a million times already. What are any other really egregious ones? Liquidity. So there is an additional point here, which is that we do have enough liquidity. We have enough gold that if we don't do fractional reserve lending, if we kind of make derivatives a little safer, we could have a stable financial system, especially if the banks aren't allowed to coordinate liquidity crunches. So one of the things I haven't talked about yet is that these central banks are all owned by the same people, the Rothschilds and the Warburgs, and then they'll coordinate global liquidity crunches, which, again, don't serve any country, but these cities like London and Frankfurt and Washington, D.C. are actually not part of the country they're in. So they're actually independent sovereign states, just like Switzerland and the Vatican. They're sovereign states, and then they have so much control over global liquidity, and they can just pull the rug out from people who are highly in debt, and they do it very frequently. So if we don't have networks of bankers, getting together and pulling out the rug from the entire world at the same time, and then only waiting until everybody has lost all of their money and is poor to buy back in and essentially get in at the bottom of the market because they control the amount of debt that is in issue at that time. If we stop that from happening and just have normal, non-conspiratorial financial markets, things would be a lot different. And people wouldn't have to... It's just so sad. Yeah, in my family, it was a pretty sad moment. We, like, just bought a new house. We moved there in 2003. And then within a year, both my parents had lost their jobs. And it was crazy. It was really sad. But I also learned to get by with less. And gave me a new perspective on life. So, it's weird. It's like, there's good stuff and there's bad stuff about it. Alright. So, yeah. It can be hard, and it can generate a lot of loosh, because financial stress, number one cause of divorce, number one cause of mental illness. People get very upset about it, and people during the Great Depression would hang themselves. And really, if you think about that, that's kind of crazy. All you lost is like some numbers or some gold, and your life is worth so much more than gold and numbers, but it is that intense. The idea that all that work was for nothing is a striking, paralyzing idea sometimes. So yeah, this stuff is definitely better researched than not. Definitely look into the Rothschilds, the Warburgs. I have this all laid out, how the Bank of England was founded. Gary Wayne talks a lot about the Knights of Malta and kind of how those secret societies and the Jesuits have moved very strongly into financial markets in the 1500s. I think as it became harder and harder to produce large-scale wars. But war is the number one way of reshaping society. That's been talked about by R. Thompson and a million other people. But the financials are easier to do rapidly, I think. And I don't know. They're both tools used by the elites in power. They'll have a false flag attack and then take over control during wartime, and that happens very frequently. So, I don't know what more I'm going to talk about in this series, but I will try... maybe I'll sing some more. Maybe I'll play some more viola. We'll see. So, thanks for watching.